it comes to Romans, the book of Romans, people start speaking in superlatives. These are some quotes. Romans is undoubtedly the greatest of Paul's letters, the most systematic in form, the weightiest in substance. This letter has made a deep impression on each succeeding generation. Now, as you read books about Romans, this is the kind of thing that you hear. No book in the world has been more carefully or diligently studied. The most profound work in existence. You know, this is the kind of things people say. At every word we feel ourselves face to face with the unfathomable. And when we look into church history, it was Romans that was a book that brought about transformation in Augustine, way back in the 3rd century. It was preaching on Romans that transformed John Wesley, that was so fundamental in this nation in the 18th century, which most historians, secular as well as church historians, Christians, would say it was the revival under Wesley that kept this country having a revolution like they had in France. Just like the power of the transformation of life. Obviously Luther with the Reformation, Karl Barth, and as Clifford said, I was involved in the SBS for many years, and as an SBS leader, whenever it came to teaching Romans, I always felt so inadequate. And the great thing about being an SBS leader is you can get other people to do it, you see. You can have in guest speakers, because I thought, I'm sure that everybody can do it better than me, because this is such an awesome book, and you know. And then I read something one day that changed everything for me. And this is what the author was saying, in effect, that we have to remember that when Paul wrote this letter to the Christians in Rome, he was actually writing it for normal people. You know, who's a normal person? We're normal people. He wasn't writing it for theologians. This wasn't a book that was written so that it could be in tiny little print with loads and loads of footnotes and you know, sit on the shelf in some seminary library. He wrote it to communicate with normal people. And the other thing that we can be sure was that he actually wanted to be understood. You know, you've been learning about inductive study and asking those questions. He wanted to be understood by his audience. And we can agree, of course, that the apostle, in his own walk, he probably would see into the things of God a lot more than us, with his insights and understanding. But even if we can't see everything he sees, at least we can look in the same direction and have a good look at what he's saying, even if we miss some of the details. And it's that last bit that I want for us. Our time, of course, is limited. We don't have a lot of time. Everything we talk about, almost, we could spend the whole session on. You know, that's the way the book of Romans is. For my desire for you guys and in this teaching is that you're able to see the flow of what he's doing, why he's doing it, and then hopefully be impacted with the power of this book, like so many others have. Now, because our time is short, I'm going to be kind of selective on the bits that I focus on. there's some bits that I really don't think you need me to talk about. You know, it's kind of straightforward. And even some of the best bits are like that. But I'm going to let you guys do that. You're studying it, you're going through it, and you can engage with that. What I want to do is use the time that we have as best as we can, with the bits that may be a little bit more difficult. And then, of course, we can, if you have questions about things that I don't talk about, you can ask those questions. Okay? Okay, where I'd like to begin is to talk about why Romans. Why would he write this letter? And even with this, there's so many ideas. Some people have thought that on that third missionary journey, the Apostle Paul had 3 months and he thought he would sit down and write his theology. Others have said actually Romans wasn't written to Rome, it was written to Jerusalem. And if you are interested, you can look in an encyclopedia under this and you would have lots of really interesting things. You kind of wonder where some of these things come from. But what I want to suggest is that we just let the text tell us. And there's some things that are actually really obvious, and that is he very simply was wanting to let them know that he was planning to visit. Now the immediate occasion let's have a look here. That Sister Phoebe, if you look in chapter 16, we see that the person who actually took the letter was this lady called Phoebe. Chapter 16 verse 1. That indicates that she was the one who actually transported the letter. I'm sure you're aware that in the first century there wasn't a postal service. So if you wanted to send a letter, you needed actually to have a stamp with 2 feet and someone to take it. And probably Phoebe coming to Rome for some reason was the occasion, in one sense, of the letter. You know, maybe she took it there specially, but the chances are she was going anyway. And Paul thought, great, here's a chance. And he could write the letter. And it's clear by the beginning and the end that the apostle had for a long time wanted to visit Rome. Now we know from Acts that he spent a lot of time in the Galatian area and then the Aegean area, southern or Greece, Macedonia and Achaia, and he had planted churches, and we can see from Romans that he was looking further west. He wanted to move west, and we can just have a look at some of these things he says here in chapter 1 verse 11. For I am longing to see you, so that I may share with you some spiritual gift to strengthen you. Or rather, so that we might be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that I've often intended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I may reap some harvest among you, as I have among the rest of the Gentiles. And so he opens a letter by saying, hey guys, I wanted to come for a long time, but I've not been able to make it, but I'm planning to come. So very simply, kind of get ready for my visit. And we go to chapter 15 as he finishes the letter. A similar kind of language. 15 verse 23. Verse 22. This is the reason that I've so often been hindered from coming to you. But now, with no further place for me in these regions, I desire, as I have for many years, to come to you, and then to go on to Spain. So this was his plan. He wanted to leave the area, the field he'd been working in, and you've just studied Acts, I know, and so you've seen all that. He wanted to move west so that he could, and again, start in Spain. New field. That's what he wanted. But we read there, he wanted to enjoy their company. And verse 29, and I know that when I come to you, I will come in the fullness and the blessing of Christ. But the reason he'd not made it sooner was because of the pressure of work in his current mission field. Now, connected very closely to this, it seems, and for want of a better phrase, I've called this the missionary occasion. He's not only writing this letter to let them know he's on his way, but also he actually wants a little bit more. He wants them to be his stepping stone into Spain. He wants to go there, spend time, and the word he uses in 1524 is informative. For I do hope to see you on my journey and to be sent on by you once I've enjoyed your company for a little while. That being sent on by you is a way of saying really what I'd like is for you to be my new base, my new home church. You remember how Antioch in Syria was a church that he was sent from, him and Barnabas. At the end of the first missionary journey, he went back there. At the end of the second missionary journey, he went back there, reported, and he would have done the same on the third missionary journey, only got put in prison. And he got a trip to Rome at the expense of the imperial government, which of course he was a prisoner. But this letter, third missionary journey, he was still talking about those plans. He wanted to go, and he wanted the church in Rome to be that new launch as he moves further west with the gospel. But of course there's an awful lot more of Romans than that. And so the question that is often raised is there is so much teaching about the gospel in Romans, and then the practical application, which is really quite specific. The question is, why all of that? He could have written just a letter as long as Philemon if he wanted to simply say, I'm coming to see you, prepare. But the very first SBS that I led at the King's Lodge, which was 1983, so that's 85 actually, 28 years ago. We had a speaker teach Romans, and he said this, and it was very intriguing to me. I don't think he's right, but it was very intriguing. He said, the reason the Apostle Paul wrote Romans was because he wanted the church to support his missionary effort. And rather than do what we might do if we wanted to raise support, let people know how great we are in our ministry and how many people we're seeing saved, or how many miracles, or how many people we're helping, this kind of thing. The apostle, rather than that, he actually focused on the gospel, and he was writing his gospel saying, guys, I want you to support me, and this is what I teach. And therefore, because this is what I teach, I want you to support me. So that was his reason. I want to suggest to you that the reason Paul wrote Romans was actually for the same reason that he wrote most of his other letters. And as you read them through on your school, most of them were written out of a pastoral situation. There was something going on in the church that needed to be addressed. And therefore the apostle is known by some as a task theologian. And that phrase means that his theology is always related to the issues that he's addressing. Now, I think probably Ephesians is a general letter, maybe one that isn't necessarily focused on a particular issue, but you go through the rest. 1 Corinthians, wow, there's a whole bunch going on in that church. 2 Corinthians, similarly. And then you go into Galatians and the issues of false teaching that are there. Colossians, false teaching. Thessalonians, a misunderstanding of the second coming. You go through all the letters and you can see that there was an issue that he was addressing. And I want to suggest to you that that's actually the same with Romans. There's an issue that he knew about in the church, and he wanted to address it even before he got there. I don't know if you've noticed it's interesting to me that chapter 16 is absolutely filled with names of people that he knew. Now, he's never been there, but he knew a lot of people. And therefore, he seemed to have a good handle on what was going on in the church. And therefore, he would know. Communication, we know, was good in the Roman world because of the roads that have been built. And interestingly, communication and travel had changed because of those roads. The Romans built those roads to get their armies quickly from one place to another. But what it actually did was opened up the world for travel, for commerce, for communication, like the world had not known before. Ideally suited for getting the gospel out, which of course was in the providence of God. And so, what is the problem? What was the issue that he was addressing? As you read Romans, one thing that you notice, and it stands out pretty readily, is that he's addressing sometimes the Gentiles and sometimes the Jews. And then sometimes he's addressing both. And when you come particularly to, as we will see, the application part, the outworking in chapter 14 and 15, again, he's addressing Jews and he's addressing Gentiles. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that the thing that the apostle is addressing there in Rome is a division between the Christian Jews, those who have come to Christ and have a Jewish background, and those who have come to Christ out of a Gentile background. And I'll take time just to show that to you if you haven't seen it, because as we look at the theology part, if you like, chapter 1 through 11, he seems to all the time be talking about these two groups. And what he's doing is showing that there's actually no distinction. You know, one of that famous verses in chapter 3, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. The all there is Jew and Gentile. It is both groups. And of course, Jew and Gentile means all is all. But the reason he's emphasizing all, because he's trying to include both. And so, if there's a division between the Jew and the Gentile Christian in Rome, the question is, why would this be, and how did it come about? So what I want to do is just run through some things very quickly, just to build up a picture for you. When you studied Acts, you would have noticed how the Jewish Christians maintained their identity as Jews. When you come to chapter 2, the day of Pentecost, the custom can often be to emphasize the fact that there were people from all the nations under heaven. And the picture we can get of Acts 2 is it was an international affair, because it lists all the different nations. But when we look carefully, we see that what it actually says is that there were Jews from every nation under heaven. So, and although there were different languages spoken, all of the people on the day of Pentecost were Jewish people. That means they had one culture, and that is the Jewish culture. They would have, the fact they came to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover meant they would have held the Jewish identity markers very strongly. They would have held the importance of circumcision of the male, of the Sabbath day, of the kosher food laws. This would have been part of their identity that they would have held to. And so when we see these 3,000 saved on the day of Pentecost, they were Jews. And then we go to the 5,000, a couple of chapters on, and they were Jews. And then as the gospel expanded and more came to Christ and the church grew, they were Jews. And so therefore they would have all had this one identity. And we keep going, and it's not until Cornelius in chapter 11, as you've seen, did things change. And it was out of this vision that Peter had, going to the house of Cornelius, there was a move, and then beyond that we see Jew and then Gentile coming in. And chapter 15 is a big moment in Acts, isn't it? The Council of Jerusalem, where the big question was, do Gentiles need to become Jews before they become Christians? Do they need to embrace these identity markers? Do they need to be converted to Judaism? And the answer, we can all say thankfully, was no. You know, I wonder what Christianity would have looked like if the outcome had been different. You know? But it wasn't. And we then see that Gentiles were coming to Christ, but they were maintaining their culture, or the lack of these Jewish identity markers. But if you look carefully in Acts, you'll find that the Jews continued to hold very strongly to those. When the apostle Paul came back after the third missionary journey, he came to Jerusalem, and the elders of Jerusalem warned him, you need to know that the church here, the Christians here, really value these things still, Paul, and they've heard rumours that you tell people out there not to bother, you tell Jews out there not to bother with these things anymore. And so they said to him, what we want you to do is go to the temple and offer a sacrifice, and when you do that, everybody will know that you uphold the law. Now, it didn't work. You know, the whole thing failed, but that's why they did it. And so as we go through the book of Acts, we see that the Jewish Christians were very strong in keeping these things. With the Jewish people, there seemed to be what I've called here the Jewish pride. And we get hints of this in Scripture because in John chapter 4, when Jesus came to Samaria, chapter 4 verse 9, there was a recognition by the woman at the well that the Jews don't have any dealings with the Samaritans. So Jesus, why are you talking to me? In Acts chapter 10, we have a classic statement there when Peter went into the home of Cornelius. I just love this. He went in their home, and the first thing he said is that you Gentiles know that it is unlawful for me, a Jew, to come into your home. But God has told me that I must not call you common or unclean. How would you feel about that? Someone come in your home, you know, it's unlawful for a Brit to come into the home of a Dutch person. Awful. But God's told me not to call you common or unclean. You know, it's kind of like, oh, you know. But that gives us a hint of the attitudes that were going on. We can see that after the Apostle Peter had gone into the home of Cornelius, the very next chapter, chapter 11, when he went back to Jerusalem, the elders of Jerusalem called him in to a meeting. And they said, Peter, we don't believe this, but we've heard rumours that you went in the home of a Gentile and you preached the gospel. You know, it was like, this is horrendous. And Peter's kind of, well, I did, and I preached the gospel, and Holy Spirit fell on them just like on us, and so we baptized them, but don't blame me, blame God, He did it. You know, it's just kind of, the whole thing is just really quite classic. And so in Scripture we get this hint, but we know from the different testimonies from history too, that there was this prayer that the rabbis used to pray, and that is, dear God, thank you, you haven't made me a Gentile, a slave or a woman. They were just, this was the kind of attitude.